Tonight we conclude our series on legendary composer Chiang Wen-yeh. After being labeled a traitor, Chiang was imprisoned by the KMT government, which fled to Taiwan in 1949. Chiang decided to stay in China, but he then became a victim of the communists, first as part of the Anti-Rightist Campaign and then during the Cultural Revolution. The music professor was put to cleaning toilets, and his musical work fell by the wayside. Much later, in the 1980s, his forgotten works were rediscovered by members of the Taiwanese diaspora. By that time, Chiang was paralyzed after a stroke and was already on his deathbed. Here's our Sunday special report.
In 1946, the KMT labeled Chiang a traitor, along with many other Japanese citizens of Taiwanese descent. Eventually, a group calling themselves the Taiwan Retrocession Salutation Committee rescued Chiang after 10 months in prison. After he was freed, a friend from prison introduced Chiang to a Catholic friar, Gabriele Allegra. Chiang then used Chinese musical modes to complete the first Catholic chorale ever written in the Chinese language.
He
was deeply moved by those words in the sacred music. A priest, Gabriele Allegra, encouraged him. Allegra's Chinese name was Lei Yongming. He told Chiang, "Write these holy songs for us," so Chiang did it. And they became popular in Catholic circles. So his songs have been sung in many Catholic churches in Taiwan, although they don't know who Chiang Wen-yeh is.
Why did he write such lovely sacred music? There's a specific reason. Chinese music is pentatonic. Like in Gregorian chant, after each line, there's a line for taking a breath for the next phrase. It's very free. So for him, it was very easy to write sacred music in a pentatonic scale.
In 1949, the KMT withdrew to Taiwan. Chiang missed his birthplace, but having been imprisoned by Chiang Kai-shek, he decided to stay in China. China's Central Conservatory of Music was founded in Tianjin by Zhou Enlai in 1950. Chiang was 40 years old when he took up the role of composition professor there. He commuted on train from Beijing to Tianjin every week and continued to compose music. But these happy years were short. In 1957, the Anti-Rightist Campaign began. Because Chiang was a member of the Taiwan Democratic Self-Government League, he was labeled a rightist, struggled against, and stripped of his job. At the time, there were only 3 Steinway pianos in China, and 1 belonged to Chiang. To make ends meet, he was forced to sell it. He had no piano, but the music was in his head. His composing slowed down considerably in this period, but never totally stopped.
The orchestration is magnificent in his Drowned in Milo River. What's special about his orchestration is that he loves to use the piccolo. The piccolo is probably more familiar in Taiwan. It is very emotionally expressive, so this was his last orchestral work.
The Cultural Revolution began in China in 1966. Chiang was persecuted and sent to a labor camp, being sent to work as a toilet cleaner. Almost all his manuscripts, records, and sheet music files were confiscated. In 1970, he was sent, along with all the teachers and students of the Conservatory of Music, to a labor camp in Baoding City, Hebei. By this time, his health was failing. He was no longer composing.
当时中国整个阶级的大革命，他们出现了文革，那当然他们像这样已经是被打入所谓黑五类的。
China had this whole class revolution and the Cultural Revolution. Of course, people like him were labeled part of the 5 black categories. Their homes were searched, property confiscated. For example, people with Taiwanese elements, all their old works had to be taken away. So apparently at that time, all these works were taken away to the Beijing Music Society. Then his family of 7 were all living in a tiny room of just 9 ping. Lots of families were crowded into a small down, and each family just had 1 room.
The Gang of 4 fell from power in 1976, and 2 years later, Jiang was rehabilitated and got his job back, like many others. His health was declining after so many years of re-education through labor, but he managed to create a final symphony, Voices of Ali Shan. In the early 1980s, as Jiang's health steadily declined, disparate members of the Taiwanese diaspora began searching for him.
到这个美国之后呢，因为各种机缘，我就住在瘸饼家里面。
Through a series of events, after I arrived in the US, I was living at the home of Alexander Cherepnin. Of course, I came across his music collection. There was one person's work that I thought was fantastic. His name was Bunya Ko. So I asked Mrs. Cherepnin, who was still alive. She was Chinese, and she said, "This guy is Taiwanese. His name is Chiang Wen-yeh."
那当时在美国有一些人从谢里法开始，谢里法老师是我们台湾美术史的一个研究家，他当时要把这些。
There was a group of people in the US, starting with Professor Xie Lifa, who was a Taiwanese researcher of art history. He wanted to write a complete history of the art history of the older generation, so they were searching for documents. A Dr. Ling Hongze in Los Angeles was constantly writing to Beijing, asking, "We have this Taiwanese composer, Chiang Wen-yeh. What are his whereabouts? Is he alive or dead? Is he there?" They kept on searching, and amazingly, they found him.
Through these efforts, overseas Taiwanese finally got in touch with Jiang in obscurity. He had had a stroke and was paralyzed and bedridden. His musical skills faded away. He passed away from a further stroke in Beijing on October 24, 1983, at the age of 73. His last work, Voices of Ali Shan, was unfinished. His first major work, Formosan Dance, was a depiction of Taiwan, just like his final work, Voices of Ali Shan. His homeland was always cherished in his heart.
纵观姜文也的一生啊，他从台湾舞曲。
If we look over his whole life, Formosan Dance was an important representative work, the start of his composing. His final, unfinished piece was Voices of Ali Shan. The tune was a mountain song that his mother had sung to him as a child.
The name Chiang Wen-yeh has been revived. Commemorative concerts and academic seminars about him have been held in Taiwan and China. Many of his works have either been lost or were never performed and are a new challenge for musicians.
姜文业老师的曲子对我来讲，困难的地方可以分成2个部分。它是结合西方的作曲的手法，但是是加上中国的音阶。
For me, what's difficult about his work can be divided into 2 parts. He combines Western composition methods with Chinese scales, so it's rather different to our normal Western 3-note chords. What I find most difficult personally is interpreting his music. Much of his work was never released, so the most difficult thing is finding a way, with the limited information available, to faithfully represent his work.
音乐家最崇拜就是自由，所以他在他的作品里头呢，他要的是
What musicians worship above all is freedom. So in his work, what he wants is to express himself as freely as possible. He writes on the score, "You can finish at the end of any bar." That gives us as performers huge room for imagination. But that's also the most difficult thing, because he lets you express totally freely.
Today, Jiang's music is resounding again. His youngest daughter only realized that her father was not just a toilet cleaner because of this rediscovery by musicians.
Xiaoyun is their second daughter. She was grown up before she found out that her father had been so famous in Japan that he was a great composer. It was much, much later that she found out about his many great achievements during the Japanese colonial era. She had always thought that her dad was a cleaner at the Conservatory of Music.
Jiang's second wife, Wu Yunzhen, went through the horrors of the Cultural Revolution with him. His Japanese wife, Nobu Takizawa, worked hard to take care of their family in Tokyo, raising 4 daughters for 60 years.
因为战后两边的运输、两边的船班就断掉了。
After the war, ships stopped traveling between Japan and China, so Mrs. Nobu had to raise 4 daughters alone in Tokyo, and that was a huge task. She had been the daughter of a wealthy family. She had to go and work in a department store. She sold dresses and umbrellas. During the bombing of Tokyo in World War II, she rented an air raid shelter just to hide her husband's music and documents. A love like that. I can only say, what a blessing for Chiang Wen-yeh to have had a wife like that.
In 1992, Jiang's 2 wives met in Taipei for the first and only time. They both attended the same seminar and took this photograph together. Jiang's discography spanned symphonies to piano tunes, operas to chamber suites, chorales, and solo works for voice. His style spanned classical Chinese splendor, religious solemnity, and Taiwanese romance. While it may have lain forgotten for some decades, his talent is now celebrated again, and his work is ringing out off the page.
他其实是被扼杀的一个天才，像他这样的，大起大落，还有就说所承受的那种时代的。
He was a suppressed genius. When one thinks of the vagaries of his fate, the fetters of the age he lived in, and his cruel persecution, it was a tragedy, truly.
Born in Taiwan, raised in Japan, lived and died in China. With the turbulence of the age as a soundtrack, Chiang Wen-yeh lived a truly astonishing life.